What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome to another video looking at some tips and tricks to for the EOS R5. So, in this video, the overreaching topic is going to be looking at changing the ISO speed using the second quick control dial, using entering, exiting auto ISO, and what is going on, how to tell what the camera is doing and thinking. So I'm going to cover a number of things in this video, so it's not quite as quick of a short tip as other videos have been. But I'm going to be covering, first of all, how to tell when the camera is metering or not metering. This is relevant with the EOS R5, but all Canon cameras, because especially in this case, what you can do, how you can switch, or what you can switch or modes with, or how you can change the ISO speed is going to change depending on whether the camera is in the, we'll call it shooting standby mode, where it's just showing you the image and waiting for you to do something, versus when it's in the metering mode, which is like when you've half pressed the shutter release until the metering timer expires. We're also going to talk about the metering timeout, which is the setting that Canon has on the R5 and other cameras that controls how long the camera will continue to meter after you release the shutter release or after you've released the AF on button. Basically, any button that starts the camera metering after you've released that. Then we're going to go into talking about sort of the meat of this episode, which is going to be changing the ISOs. So changing in manual, switching into and out of auto using, and again, this is all using the quick control dial and the capability that's available in the camera to override the auto ISO setting and pick an ISO while the camera is in auto. So I think for the majority of this video, it's just going to be easier if we're looking at the camera while I'm talking, or looking at what the camera screen shows while I'm talking instead of looking at me. So let's jump over and look at what the camera screen shows and get into the meat of this video. Okay, so here we are back looking at the rear or the display, what the camera's seeing essentially. And the first thing I want to talk about is the metering system, or metering on the R5, and specifically when it's active, when it's not active. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, what to look for to know whether your camera is currently metering or not, what the metering timer is, what it controls, how to change it, because that is an option in this camera, and then how to get out of the metering mode as quickly as possible, because maybe you want to get out of auto ISO or get into auto ISO, something like that, and you don't want the metering timer to wait for the metering timer to expire. So, as I said, it's important to understand whether the camera is metering or not metering, simply because it controls what the second quick control dial will do when you change a ISO setting, or when you turn it to change the ISO setting. So in order to tell whether your camera is in the metering mode or not, there's a couple of things you can look for. Now, this isn't always guaranteed to work because, well, in different situations, different things are going to happen. So the first thing you can look for is if you're in one of the auto exposure modes, so aperture priority or shutter priority, and even I think flexible priority will change the display. Also program AE. The camera will not show you the calculated exposure handle, so until it starts metering. So right now I have my camera set in aperture priority, which you can tell by the big AV in the top corner. And you can see in the status bar at the bottom, it says my, aperture values f8, the exposure bar is, or the metering bar is there, and it's showing that I've got a -1 stop of exposure compensation dialed in. And at the far right, the ISO indicator is there, and it's currently set to auto. Now, if I would, in fact, let's take it off auto and let's set it to something else. Just so that doesn't get in the way of potentially confusing us. So the first thing you can look for is when I start the camera metering, you will see, because I'm in aperture priority, a shutter speed appeared at the far left of the status bar. So That's one of the indicators that you can look for. If a shutter speed appears when you're in aperture priority, the camera's metering. And if I let off the shutter release and let the metering time out, you'll see that the shutter speed disappears. Also, you'll see that the an icon appeared next to the exposure meter bar, the meter bar, that indicates that I can change that setting using the quick control dial on the back of the camera. Those are two of the things you can look for. Is the camera showing you that extra icon in aperture priority or shutter priority? Is it showing you the or the calculated exposure handle? If you're shooting in auto ISO, you'll see an ISO speed there instead of it saying auto. So that's another thing you can look for if you're looking to see if you're in metering mode. Unfortunately, in some cases, for example, bulb, there really isn't a good way to tell if the camera is in metering mode or not, other than that it just behaves that way. So if you're in metering mode, the question then is, how do you get out of metering mode? Well, the first thing you can do, as I already showed you, is just let the camera sit for a couple of seconds. By default, this is the metering timer in the camera. So by default, the metering timer on the R5 and all Canon cameras runs for 8 seconds. You can change this, and to change this, if you go into the menus and you go to the Shoot 7 menu and you select metering timer, as you can see mine's set to 4, you can change it from 4 seconds all the way out to 30 minutes. Now, what the metering timer does on a Canon camera is controls, first of all, how long it will display those calculated exposure settings. So you can take your finger off the shutter release briefly and not have the camera just completely stop doing what you were doing. For example, if your finger slips or something like that, it doesn't completely knock you back to ground zero. It also controls how long the camera will hold the exposure lock if you're using a function like auto exposure lock, what the star button is defaultly programmed to do by default. That will stay locked for as long as you have the metering timer set for. So if your metering timer set for 30 minutes and you hit the star button, it will keep that exposure lock active for 30 minutes. There is another way to get out of the metering mode quickly. So if you really need to get the camera into auto or out of auto ISO at the drop of a hat, and you don't want to wait, or you can't wait the 4, 8, or whatever seconds that you have the metering timer set for. Maybe you have, say, for example, you have the metering timer set for a minute or 10 minutes or something like that. And you're not going to wait for that to completely expire, and you want to get the camera out of metering mode. There's a couple of ways you can do this. The fastest way is to double press the mode button on the top of the camera. So anytime you change the camera into and out of a major settings, a major mode change, the camera will reset its metering setting. So if you press the mode, when you go into changing modes, that's one of those things. The pressing the menu button twice will also do the same thing. So you press the menu button, it cancels anything that the camera's doing for metering, open or displays the menu, and pressing the menu button again takes you back to shooting without re-engaging the meter. The third one is pressing or double pressing the playback button. Again, takes the camera into review mode, then back into shooting mode, and it's not going back into shooting mode in a way that will start the camera's meter. So normally, for example, normally you might hit the menu button, and then to go back to shooting, you'd half press the shutter release. That's going to restart the camera meter because you're telling the camera to meter essentially, and that will, again, you'll have to wait. It won't get you out of the metering mode. So if you need to get out of metering real quick, double pressing the mode button is probably the fastest way to do it on the R5. Okay, so now that I've explained the whole situation with metering, let's start talking about what is going on with how the camera indicates the ISO modes, or what the ISO modes are available and how the camera indicates them. So the manual basically will tell you you have two things kind of to do with ISOs. You have manual ISO and you have auto ISO. And in fact, there's actually sort of a third mode, which is a manual override for the auto ISO. So let's talk about what you see in the camera. We'll start with when it's not metering. So if you were set to manual ISO or a manual ISO speed, when the camera isn't metering, what you're going to see is the little icon that says ISO, black text on a white background. It's right next to the number, and a number next to it, or low or L or H if you are in low or high expanded. So as you can see, there's just a number next to the ISO, and I can change it using the dial on the top of the camera. If you turn the dial all the way down to past the lowest setting, so past L, slower than L, it changes to auto. The text is there is instead of a number. And this means this is indicating to you that the camera is in auto ISO. And again, we're not in that metering mode. So when the camera's metering, if you're in manual ISO, nothing changes. You will still just see a number. Where things change is if you go back to, or if you're in auto mode. So if you're set to auto and you start metering, what you'll see happen is, first of all, the big auto text disappears and a little auto appears under where it says ISO. And then the camera is displaying the calculated ISO value that it's going to use to the right of where it says ISO in auto. So in this example, the camera is calculating that to get my minimum shutter speed of a 20th of a second and at the aperture of f8, it needs to shoot at ISO 5000. Now, as I said, there's an override for the auto ISO that you can set while the camera is metering, and I'll come back talking about how to set this stuff again specifically. When you have an override set, the first thing you'll notice is that, first of all, this doesn't apply when the camera isn't metering. The camera has to be metering for the auto exposure or the auto ISO override to work. Second of all, you'll notice that where it said auto in white text under the ISO icon has now turned into gray text under the ISO icon. This is telling us that, and of course, to the right of that ISO and auto is the ISO speed that we've currently selected. So the gray auto is telling us that we're in auto ISO mode, but if we don't, but we've overridden what the camera has calculated and set our own ISO. So that brings me to the last thing, which is changing the ISO using, again, just the top control. And I've already kind of touched on this. So if you're in manual, or if you're using manual ISOs, all you have to do is turn the second quick control dial on the top of the camera. So right now I'm at 400, 1250, 640, 500, whatever. It does not matter if I have the camera metering and I change the manual ISO. When the camera stops metering, that will still be the ISO that the camera is set to. So that's manual ISOs. What about auto ISOs? And this is where it gets a little bit more tricky. Auto ISOs can only be enabled or disabled through the quick control dial when the camera is not metering. So I think this is a protection there essentially to prevent you as a user from accidentally, if you were shooting at 100 and you decided you wanted to go to low for the slower shutter speed and you clicked it twice accidentally and the camera jumped into auto, and that might cause the ISO speed to jump up to, say, 6400 or something like that, that would be undesirable. So Canon doesn't let you enter or exit auto ISO while the camera is metering. So again, as I showed earlier, to enter auto, when the camera isn't metering, you turn the ISOs to lower and lower settings, and then one setting past low is auto. And again, to disable auto ISO while the camera isn't metering, you turn the dial the other way to increase the ISOs. And as soon as, one click above auto is going to be low, and then up from there. Now, if I have the camera set, now this is what the situation is with metering, when the camera's metering. And remember, this is going to be primarily when your finger is on the shutter release or the AF on button. So, that the metering is happening. So if the camera is metering and I'm in a manual ISO, I cannot set the camera to auto. It will only go as far as low, and it will not go any further. Likewise, if I'm in auto, I can override the ISO, but I can't set the camera back to manual. So anything that I'm setting here, the range is going to be from low to high. It's not going to let me set the camera to manual. Which brings me to the last kind of discussion point here, which is overriding the ISO in auto. So this is a temporary override. So for example, again, in this situation, I've got a 20th of a second shutter speed. Let's just say I was shooting wide open, or I need to shoot at f8 for enough depth of field, but I don't have enough shutter speed. So I'm in auto. It's calculated a 5,000 or ISO 5000 as my shutter speed, and I can override it just by turning the dial while I'm half pressing the shutter release. So while the camera's metering, again, I could also be holding the AF on button. And the camera, I will set to the ISO speed that I tell it to use. So in this case, I bumped it up about a stop, or a little over a stop, and the shutter speed has adjusted, and I can go shoot. Now, the ISO speed here is, again, a temporary override. When the meter timer runs out or the meter shuts off, this will go back to displaying auto, and when I go back in, it will go back to the auto-calculated value. Now, there are potential situations where you might want to reset the auto ISO speed because, you changed it, you weren't really paying a lot of attention to what it was originally, but you just want to go back to it, and you don't want to wait. Like, you're in the middle of shooting, you don't want to wait for things to time out. And there's a way to do that as well. So what you can do is, in this case, I've overridden the auto ISO. All you want to do is press the MFM button and then half press the shutter release. Don't touch a dial, don't push the MFM button repeatedly, just one press of the MFN button and then right back on half press of the shutter release. That will cause the metering system to shut off, and when you half press the MFN button will cause the metering system to shut off. When you half press the shutter release, it restarts the meter from scratch and will basically reset the ISO speed to what the camera calculates. Now, this works that way if your MFN button is bound to the dial function setting. If it's not, there's a couple of other alternatives that you have. One of those is if your AF point select button is bound to the AF point selection menu. You can hit the AF point select button and then half press the shutter release. Again, not pressing any dials or buttons or anything else when you're in that menu. It's just jump to the thing and jump half back to the shooting with a half press of the shutter release. That will do the same thing, as will, now I can't demonstrate that because my camera's not set up for the AF point select menu. See my video on that. I think it's one of the first videos in the series. I'll put a card to it. What you can also do is use the Q button or the quick control menu button. So if you push the quick control menu button and then go back to shooting, it will reset the meter and it'll go back to the calculated auto ISO value. So that's, in a nutshell, how the camera displays, interfaces, and allows you to control auto ISO with the quick control dial and manual ISO and overrides and all of this. Now, obviously, this is something that can be a bit confusing and it can be a bit complicated. And the reason for that really just comes down to the fact that, generally speaking, powerful functionality comes with a level of complexity. Now, if you don't want to deal with this, you have some options. So first of all, if you use the menus or a menu, any menu, it doesn't matter, to change the ISO speed, you can always drop into or out of auto without having to worry about what mode the camera is. So this includes if you have ISO settings as a button function menu programmed to, for example, the MFN button. It applies if you go through the menus, to change the ISO, which is probably the least efficient way to do ISO changes, but it works there, or that applies there. And it applies if you use the on-screen buttons where you can touch where it says ISO and change the setting there. So any of those modes or any of those methods of changing ISO, all you have to do is that, and then change the ISO into or out of auto, or whatever you want to do. And you don't have to worry about whether the camera's metering or not. It will switch into and out of auto automatically. So with that said, I hope this was at least a little bit informative, or a little bit useful, or a little bit cleared up a little bit of the behavior of what's going on in the camera. I hope I explained this clear enough, because, well, as I said, it is a little bit complex when you start diving into the details, the ins and outs and details of it. But, again, if you just want to shoot manual ISO, just shoot manual ISO and not worry about it. It's only when you really start dancing around a lot that this is something that an added complexity. So if you did find this useful, or at least informative, please consider smashing that thumbs up button. Also, please consider subscribing. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.